Tanse, Kanshi, bonjour, hello, Melanie Griffith Brice, Nitsika Son, Michif Nia, Lac de Prairie, Cajete, Otinia, Egua, La Bruchère, Sagahigan, Oscana, Kaasategi, Me Guats Ni Weekend, Nisto Nitaniswak Egua Niso Nosim Swak. So I'm in the process of reclaiming my language, Northern Michif, which is a mix of Cree verbs and French nouns. So thank you for allowing me the space to use my language. I also want to acknowledge that I am right now coming from Treaty 4, the land of the Niheo, Anishinaabe, Nakota, and homeland of the Métis.
Can you tell Miss Casper?
Yeah. Could I get you to mute your microphones, please? Thank you. I'm from a bit further north from where I am. I do have ancestors who were from this area. But as I said in my introduction, I was born in Meadow Lake, which is in the northwest in the province in this land that we now call Saskatchewan in Canada. And I grew up at Jackfish Lake. That's just to give you some context to where I'm physically located and where my people come from. So I'm going to get started. I'm just going to share my screen here. And so just to situate myself, as I said in my introduction to my language, identify as Michif. I'm a citizen of the Métis Nation in Saskatchewan. I have 3 adult daughters and 2 granddaughters. And I'm here in the Faculty of Education at the University of Regina. And so if you could just, take a moment and in the chat, if you wouldn't mind, saying where you're from, maybe even where you're working and teaching, or if you're comfortable sharing with who your peoples are, or if you're a settler to this land that we now call North America, or wherever you might be calling your homeland. And I'll also throughout try to monitor the chat for any kinds of questions and things like that. So I'm not, oh, I do see something in the chat there. Oh, yeah. Yes, there definitely is some French in the Michif language. And it's a very, very unique language in that regard, that it takes the Cree verbs and the French nouns. So also this is being recorded, so I want to acknowledge those people who are watching the recording. So you'll be missing out on some of the interactive features that I have planned throughout this presentation. So welcome to those who are here and those who are watching the recording. Just to further, while people are putting where they're from in the chat, I just want to further sort of situate myself and provide some context from how my learning journey has brought me to be able to talk to you today. So I graduated from a teacher education program called SUNTEP, which stands for the Saskatchewan Urban Native Teacher Education Program. It's specifically for Métis students. It was just a great environment to learn, how to be a teacher, because our Michif Métis culture was so prominent throughout. So after I received my Bachelor of Education through that program, I was an elementary classroom teacher for 10 years and is also a teacher librarian. I did my master's focusing in curriculum on Métis teacher identity and looking at how our identity determines our choices as teachers in regards to teaching methods, resources, curriculum, that kind of thing. And this led me to further research on the use of storytelling as an instructional method. My doctoral research focused on looking at Indigenous children who were identified as successful readers and how they used multiliteracies when their teacher incorporated technology into reading instruction. I also had a gig. I worked for a bit for the Ministry of Education in Alberta as the Director of Curriculum in the First Nations Métis and Inuit Education Division. And currently I'm an associate professor in the Faculty of Education at the University of Regina, as well as the Gabriel Dumont Research Chair in Métis Michif Education. So Metnoda is where I call home. And so I have a picture here of the view of the lake that I grew up. And I'm just wanting to take a quick scroll through to hear where people are coming from. Oh yeah, parent teacher, it's that time of year, parent teacher conferences. Oh, that's fabulous to see all the people and where people are coming from. So Metnoda is Cree elder. Alma Poitras told me that the word comes from, means like the right place. So to me, it's just the perfect way to describe my home because it's definitely the right place. I grew up identifying more with my Michif, Métis heritage, more than my father's Welsh Dutch. It's not to say that my father's cultural inheritance was not as important. He brought different traditions, but they were more of a culture of place than a cultural heritage. And Bell Hooks writes about a culture of place as a feeling of belonging and choosing where and how to live. And I believe that it's this culture of place is just as important as the Michif culture that I was raised in and that was nurtured. So in this way, identity is sustained through a sense of belonging, like either to a place, group, or community. And Métis scholar Brenda McDougall writes that identity is namely encompassed in one's connection to home, which is in turn definable by land and family. And so here I just have some pictures of my family, my home. So there's me with my mother and my sister, my grandmother and my aunt, and some of the old pictures of Nimusham Pan, Nokam Pan, so my great grandparents in the bottom right corner, and then their wedding pictures right above that. And then the other picture in the middle, that's my mom and some of her siblings when and they were little. I think it's really, I come from a very, very proud Métis Michif family, and so I want to acknowledge those my parents, my grandparents, and aunts and uncles who nurtured my cultural identity. So if you've noticed, I've used the term Michif, but I also have in there Métis because a lot of people have not heard the term Michif, but I use it because the term Métis, a lot of people use the term Métis here in Canada if they have like any kind of Indigenous ancestry, right? That comes from the French language. It means mixed. But I don't like to, I used to use it, but I don't like to use it as so much to identify for myself anymore. I identify as Michif because I feel that when people take on the term Métis, when they just are using it to say they have Indigenous ancestry, it really diminishes our sovereignty as a Métis nation. So, as Michif or Métis, we're a distinct Indigenous group. We have our own culture, traditions, perspectives, and languages. And when people use this term just to, connotate any kinds of ancestry, it definitely, takes away from our sovereignty. So in this talk today, I want to talk about multiliteracies. And this is a term that was coined by the New London group. And they found that because of the advances in technology and globalization, we need to look at language and literacy learning and teaching differently. And so they expanded that definition of literacy to address that continual shifting and evolving of literacy learning and teaching as a result of cultural diversity and the emergence of digital technology and globalization. So they use this term multiliteracies to describe the multiple ways of knowing and the use of different literacy practices depending on the context and the cultural and social aspects. So multiliteracies have, really definitely moved to the forefront because of advances of technology. However, Indigenous people have belonged to multiliterate societies since time immemorial, right? So I truly believe that Indigenous students are poised to use multiliteracies as a bridge to school literacies. Multiliteracies help bring students to bring their own experiences, backgrounds, practices into the classroom and involve multiple ways that meaning can be constructed and represented, thus honoring Indigenous epistemologies. So with Indigenous epistemology, what we know from many Indigenous scholars is it's based on coming to know oneself through participation, collaboration, and connection to a place environmentally, socially, and spiritually. So learning in Indigenous communities involves collaboration, the distribution of knowledge, and experiential participation, which are also the hallmarks of new literacies. So Indigenous knowledge systems have governed the way Indigenous people live their lives. Indigenous knowledges are situated in personal experiences, transmitted orally, experienced subjectively, they're holistic, and communicated through story. And so traditionally, our children learned experientially on the land and knew how to speak their languages. Now those ways of knowing and those ways of learning and knowing aren't such a big part or in some places not part of formal schooling at all. And so this is problematic when Indigenous children do not have access to the land for learning or cannot communicate with elders in their language. Not only does learning happen through language, deeper understandings are inscribed within Indigenous languages that can't be translated. So if Indigenous languages are not taught, then these teachings are also absent. Also, not only has the intergenerational transmission of knowledge been disrupted due to residential schools and other systems of oppression and assimilation, but so has the creation and refinement of our knowledge systems. So Aboriginal literacies, and I'm using the term Aboriginal because that's how it's used in the literature that I'm referencing, are characterized by holism, the integration of culture and language, which attests to its value for Indigenous learners. They are multiple, they're built on relationships between the environment and community, which helps us to learn in a variety of ways. So Aboriginal literacies refer to Indigenous people's use of multiple texts from the environment and their experiences to develop relationships. Some of these texts are dreams, visions, oral stories, artifactual objects in the environment, and I'm citing Leroy Littlebear there. So therefore, Aboriginal literacies are more than just reading and writing. They include relationships with the environment and community, and interpreting visions, negotiating the meaning of stories, communicating with nature, and reading the landscape are just a few. And as I said, right, these are characterized by holism, the inclusion of culture and language, and through the development of the oral tradition of storytelling. Tanya Cordoba suggests that embracing literacy from a holistic perspective requires that we understand education as a lifelong process that affirms Aboriginal identities, cultures, and epistemologies. And Elizabeth Noll found in her research with Lakota children that they also transected with texts in their environment by connecting lived experiences and cultural knowledge to construct meaning. So here on this next slide, this is a pair of wraparound moccasins that were made by my late grandmother. What makes these moccasins significant is that they are an example of an Aboriginal literacy because they do tell a story. So the vamps, that's that top beaded part, these were on my grandfather's moccasins. And after he passed away, my grandmother took apart his moccasins and used the vamps to make me a pair. And she used moose hide to make these. So now these moccasins are texts, right? They're texts that are read, they tell a story, they provide us with information and knowledge, and likewise are part of our Indigenous knowledge systems. So what I would like you to do right now is in the chat, if you could just put in some examples that you feel of our like multiliterate texts. So, you know, I used moccasins. I've also, I didn't include in this one, but there is a gathering, it's called the Young Women's Circle of Leadership through the University of Alberta, where they gather together young Indigenous girls from like 11 to 18 to do cultural and language learning. And one of the participants in that gathered together like different like fungi and was explaining, you know, what those things mean and by being able to look at them. And so, you know, that's another example of an Indigenous literacy or Aboriginal literacy. Oh, I love that. The photo albums, right? Oh, excellent. Cradle board. Great examples. And so when we think about all of these different, oh yeah, the music, drawing, storytelling, food traditions, oh, excellent, excellent examples. This is so awesome. I'm so happy to see this because then it's like, oh, do people understand what I was talking about? And you all got it. So that's really, really good. Oh yeah, the women's applique designs. That's a really interesting one. There is a Métis artist. Her name is Sherry Farrell Reset. She actually works at the University of Regina, but she has done her research around the stories around like beadwork, because you could often see, you know, through different beadwork patterns where different people are from, right? And that there's stories when, you know, just like the moccasins being passed down. There's, you know, stories attached to those different artifacts. So why multiliteracies are significant is that they fit into Indigenous ways of knowing through language. So we know that language is connected to our identities and activities. We use language to communicate to others. And we communicate to others how we see ourselves, how we want to be seen, all through language. And our primary discourses are culturally specific, right? That's the one that we learn at an early in life. It's our everyday language. James G. Defines discourses as the distinctive ways of acting, interacting, valuing, feeling, dressing, thinking, believing with other people, so as to enact a specific socially recognizable identities. And so schools have a secondary discourse, and often this secondary discourse does not align with minority groups and their primary discourses. So using multiliteracies enables educators to move away from deficit views of language and literacy learning. So when we learn about a child's social and cultural environment and find ways to adapt their practices rather than see the child as the problem that needs to be fixed. Because people from different social cultural backgrounds have different ways of making sense of their experiences and communicating those experiences with others. Like, for example, the importance of silence. you know, how we use it to reflect or consider what you might say next. When I worked for the Ministry of Education in Alberta, we often brought in elders and knowledge keepers and cultural advisors, you know, to guide our work. And there would often be silence after someone spoke. But when non-Indigenous people from other departments, they didn't understand that role of silence as part of our discussion, and they would try to fill those spaces with talking. So if children are able to utilize multiliteracies, such as accessing multiple ways of knowing and using different literacy practices that acknowledge their cultural identities, then school literacy practices like reading become more meaningful and perhaps more interesting. In Hawaii, the Kamehameha Elementary Education Program, or KEEP, utilized an approach to literacy instruction that was culturally responsive. So the teachers adjusted their instruction to create learning situations that the students would find comfortable. So the teachers in KEEP utilized a discussion technique, which was similar to a Hawaiian community speech event known as Talk Story, where the participants sort of engage in a co-narration. You know, it's speaking in a rhythmic alternation to present a narrative to the group. So after the teacher asks a question, they do not call on one student to respond, but instead allow the children to collaborate to generate the answers. And the teacher might paraphrase a child's response to keep the discussion on track. But the children are in control of who speaks and when. So when we bring in these cultural literacy practices, we can see that students are far more engaged in the school literacy practices. So using multiliteracies helps students to bring their own experiences, backgrounds, and practices into the classroom, and highlights that different meanings are possible depending on the context, individuals, and cultures. So, and as I said before, right, Indigenous communities have always been multiliterate, but because written or print text has been privileged, the concept of multiliteracies appears to be a recent concept, when in fact, like, it's been around a lot longer within our communities. In my own research, I found that the focal students used multiliteracies to bring their lived experiences, their background knowledge, and funds of knowledge into school literacies. When we think of multiliteracies, is that multiple ways that meaning can be constructed and represented. And this enabled the students to co-construct meaning by permitting diversity in ways of knowing and representing what they came to know. And the focal students, they found ways to make connections to their lived experience and represent their identities through the use of multiliteracies. They accessed funds of knowledge from their family and cultures and lived experiences as part of multiliteracies. And just to clarify, the funds of knowledge, those are the resources that students use to make meaning and in the design and process to represent meaning. Dr. Lewis Moll, Kathy Amante, Deborah Neff, and Norma Gonzalez describe funds of knowledge as the historically accumulated and culturally developed bodies of knowledge and skills essential for household or individual functioning and well-being. And Moll and the others talked about funds of knowledge in terms of resources that we access within our families. And funds of knowledge can include all types of cultural knowledge that helps to make sense of our world and to negotiate literacy spaces. Flipping a page here. So the students in my research, they resided in an urban context. So they had access to many different types of knowledge from their social participation and lived experiences with family, community, and as well as popular culture. And in the research of Drs. Moll, Amante, and Gonzalez,
put the date down.
They found
the date.
Sure. Oh, I put it up here.
Oh, somebody has their microphone still on?
No. Only if I'm needed for building. How specific can you building? I want 3 maps.
Melissa, I don't know if you can hear me, but if could you mute your microphone, that would be great, please.
Sorry.
Thank you. So in the research of Dr. Moll, Amante, Neff, Gonzalez found that if teachers look to their students' families and lived experiences, they can make learning more relevant by tapping into the students' cultural and cognitive resources. And I found in my research that if teachers also tap into children's lived experiences with popular culture, that can also be used as a cultural and cognitive resource. So what I would like you to sort of put into the chat, or what are some strategies that you found that would support students in representing their knowledge in meaningful ways? Like I've mentioned already, popular culture as a resource. You know, a lot of times with students, they have that same lived experiences with their peers around maybe movies or TV shows that can be brought into the classroom with references to celebrities or athletes. Okay, we see story circles. Any other strategies? If you think of like some of the different texts that you had mentioned previously in the chat about how you could bring, you know, there was like food traditions, music, drawing, storytelling, quilts, weave baskets and pottery. Oh, hair braiding. Oh my goodness, love that. Those, like how could you bring those into the classroom? Like what kinds of strategies could you use to bring so that students use those, are representing their knowledge using those kinds of texts? So, because a lot of times we just sort of focus on the reading and the writing, as opposed to finding other ways that we can use the multiliteracies. Oh, incorporate their experiences through music, poetry, spoken word. Oh yeah, using the environment, especially right where you live, by the river. Oh, the cultural knowledge about the weather, being able to read clouds, that is something that growing up at the lake that we had to learn how to do, so we knew when to come in off the lake. Yeah, showcases. Fabulous. Thank you everybody for sharing those ideas. So the last sort of piece that I want to talk about is student voice and agency. And one of the things that like I believe is that students will experience success academically if their agentic actions are accepted and validated. So autonomy and agency are important attributes that support the value of independence. If you're familiar with the Circle of Courage with Doctors Broken Leg and Bento, where they talk about mastery and independence and generosity, and I'm forgetting one. So these are part of the child rearing practices, and if we can bring those into our classroom spaces, because in many Indigenous communities, you know, we're teaching our children the importance of independence and giving them those opportunities to exercise autonomy. And so creating that those spaces, finding room for those in our teaching. Doctors Moje and Lewis describe agency as the strategic making and remaking of selves, identities, activities, relationships, cultural tools and resources and histories as embedded within relations of power. And they also explain that learning shapes subject formation, which shapes identity enactments that allow for different types of agency. And we know that power is a social construction, and in most classrooms, teachers and students agree on the teacher's power, right? By carrying on that history of education and that mutual engagement. But really, oh, thank you. Yes, belonging. Excellent. That was the fourth, the fourth one there that I couldn't remember from Dr. Broken Leg's work on Circle of Courage. So when we look at power, really the teacher only has power like insofar as the members of like that community of practice negotiate like how it will evolve. And this a lot of times when we think in terms of students who are silent in the classroom. So Dr. Elizabeth Moje and Dr. Cynthia Lewis acknowledged that learning is shaped by and mired in power relationships. And so students will either participate in the teacher sanctioned activity or remain on the periphery. And so when students choose to be silent, as educators, we need to be mindful about what that silence is saying, right? So like when we look at participation in a classroom structure, that participation is often situated within a Western value system, right? Just like success, it's defined by Western worldviews, where certain behaviors are privileged. I think even with universities, like how many times on course syllabus, I will see instructors put a percentage towards participation. And I always challenge that, because what does that look like? What does participation mean? Because if I, just because I'm not like contributing or raising my hand, which is, you know, how the types of behaviors that are valued as participation, that doesn't mean that I'm not learning, okay? And so oftentimes in classrooms, silence is viewed as either an unwillingness or a lack of ability. Susan Ernston Phillips, she did research with Native American students on the Warm Springs Reservation, and she found that the students didn't respond because the teacher decided who spoke and when. And so oftentimes as, you know, teachers in our practice, we'll disregard a community's value for autonomy, and where students determine when they are ready to participate and how they are ready and how they're going to participate. So when we have curriculum that's inclusive of Indigenous ways of knowing, that's about creating those spaces for students' agency. And students then have the agency to determine how they will use language and behave in learning, which shapes their identity and informs their engagement. So one of the things that I found in my research is that students socially constructed their identities through the use of talk. And through talk, students were able to exercise agency while also accessing their funds of knowledge. And so by creating spaces, like, you know, when we're planning our lessons and using pedagogical strategies that allow for students to talk, right? Because talk has students, they use talk to make sense of their experiences, organize their thoughts and ideas, share and witness the experiences of others. And, you know, as I said before, silence gives us time to think about what has been said and think about connections to our own lived experiences. So as teachers, when we're silent, that creates space for students' agency to choose how they will participate. So using in when we have create those spaces and we allow students to use talk, access their funds of knowledge, then they can use those things to construct meaning and bring in those multiliteracies and make those school literacy practices far more culturally relevant. And I found that students brought in a lot of their own experiences, their backgrounds, out of school literacy practices, and thus brought in those diverse ways of knowing into literacy. So, I've just sort of gone through this, I must have read it a lot slower when I practiced, because I've gone through it quickly. So I guess just in terms of like final words, looking at how we use multiliteracies so that students can represent something meaningful in a way that honors who they are and where they are from. Multiliteracies bring to the forefront the importance of students' experiences and their identities into the classroom. It integrates Indigenous ways of knowing by using by like honoring and acknowledging that there are multiple ways of knowing something and multiple ways to represent knowledge, and multiple ways that we can share who we are and our experiences. So that's the references, and then my contact information, whether email, Twitter, and then LinkedIn. So I'll just stop sharing, and I will also stop recording.